All right. Well, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. On behalf of Acting Director Michael Costigan of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, I'd like to welcome you. My name is Tom Woodmansee, and I'm a Senior Advisor for CNA and BJA's Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program, and I'm also a retired police officer. I'm really pleased to be providing a brief introduction for today's webinar. But first, I just want to recognize that with all of the current challenges that our society is facing, from COVID to protests and violent crime, our thoughts are with you, your agencies, and your communities. And we greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webinar. So today's webinar is part one of a two-part series, and today we're going to focus on the role of police body-worn cameras relating to recent public protests in larger cities. We're going to talk about some benefits, challenges, and solutions. This webinar was actually based upon a survey that was conducted by Arizona State University with our body-worn camera sites about their experiences with protests. And the hope is to identify some benefits, challenges, and problems that are associated with protests and body-worn camera programs. So we are very pleased to have an outstanding panel of experts to discuss this. You're going to hear from two nationally renowned researchers who will talk about the survey results, along with some significant highlights surrounding research in the country and the world, and best practices involving policing and protests related to body-worn cameras. We'll also hear from an Assistant Chief of Police who has vast experience on many impacts in the field related to this topic. So this is another in a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. We want to thank BJA for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program, in the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and in a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies around the country in implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, county, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in many ways, and we're grateful that they do. So just a few comments for your awareness before we start the webinar. Please keep your phones on mute to avoid background noise. The webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to view it, and others can too later on our website. And there will be opportunities for questions at the end of the webinar. So please make your thoughts and questions known. One of our goals for this is to provide an opportunity for you to network with each other and hear what you all have to say as well. You can chat your questions and comments at the right of your screen to the BWC PIP button, or you can comment at the end of the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond to questions. Now, we've already had some good pre-webinar questions come in that we'll address the best we can as well. So following this webinar, you'll receive a request to evaluate it. We ask that you please complete the evaluation and give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. And also importantly, let us know any other topics you think we should cover on future webinars. So I'd like to now just turn to introducing our expert panel. So I'll start off with Dr. Mike White. Mike is the co-director of BJA's Body-Worn Camera TTA program and is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. He's an associate director of ASU's Center for Violence and Prevention and Community Safety. Dr. White has commented extensively in the media on body-worn cameras, including in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time Magazine, to name some. He's actually also testified before Congress on body-worn cameras. Mike is the primary author on DOJ's body-worn camera toolkit. Dr. White has published numerous articles on policing, and I've been fortunate enough to have worked with Mike for several years now, and he truly is the go-to person for body-worn camera. Next, we have Jeffrey Carroll from the DC Metro Police Department. Chief Carroll is currently serving as the Assistant Chief managing the Homeland Security Bureau. He is part of an executive command staff that is responsible for implementing the goals and objectives set by the Chief of Police and the Mayor of the District of Columbia. Chief Carroll is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and also received his master's degree in security and safety leadership from George Washington University. And our third panel member is Dr. Ed McGuire. Ed is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Arizona State University, where he also serves as an associate director for the Center of Violence Prevention and Community Safety. Dr. McGuire's research focuses primarily on policing and violence. He has lectured or carried out research in 24 different countries, and he's written and edited multiple books and journals on policing. So you can see that this is a great and very strong panel for today's topic. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to our facilitator, Dr. White. Dr. White, Mike, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tom. And Tom just introduced the three presenters, and that is, in fact, the order in which we're going to proceed. I'll start off presenting some of the results of the survey that we completed, and then we'll hear from Assistant Chief Carroll. And I think that Assistant Chief Carroll's presentation is going to really put some meat on the bones of some of the things we're going to talk about with the survey. And then Dr. McGuire will talk a bit about policing protests. He's probably the leading scholar in the country, if not the world, on this topic. And then I'll come back toward the end and act as a discussant and highlight some of the common themes, and then we can open it up for the Q&A. So to jump in, obviously, as Tom suggested, it's been a difficult time the past few months in policing. There have been protests, obviously, across the United States and the globe. Some of those protests have been violent. Some have not been. At some of those protests, police officers have worn body-worn cameras and others not. So what we wanted to do was take advantage of the network of more than 400 law enforcement agencies that we have through this program, and to capture their experiences over the last few months, to have those agencies tell their story in this regard, tell us about some of the challenges they've experienced, some of the benefits, all of this obviously tied to the use of body-worn cameras. And this isn't an academic exercise. Our goal is to then relay the experiences that we're hearing from agencies, and to do that in a way that's beneficial, not just to the TTA grantees, but to all law enforcement agencies. And this is the first step in doing that, and there'll be additional steps. We have another webinar planned in August, in which we'll focus on smaller agencies, and then we'll produce a report as well. So if your agency has worked with researchers before, you know that typically we work at the speed of slow. We'll say we'll be back in 6 months, and we'll tell you what we find then. And what we wanted to do here was to avoid that problem. Obviously, these are timely issues, and we wanted to move quickly. So I think it was the last week of May, we came up with this idea of fielding a survey that would capture, like I said, some of the experiences that agencies have been having in this area of protests and the use of body-worn cameras. And so really in a period of less than a month, we devised the survey, sent the survey link as Qualtrics to more than 400 current and former TTA sites. That first email went out on June 11th, and then there were 2 reminders. So given perhaps your prior experiences with researchers, this is us really moving at lightning speed. The good news is that we had 100 completed surveys, which, depending on how you count it, your response rate is right around 25%, which is really, really good for doing research in this kind of way. And it tells me that a lot of our grantees were interested in talking about their experiences and relaying what they've been dealing with, and specifically with the area of body-worn cameras, the benefits and challenges. We also, one of the initial questions we focused on was asking agencies about their size. We went into this realizing that agency experiences are probably going to vary quite a bit by the size of the department, the size of the jurisdiction. And so what we want to do today is I'll present some results from all 100 completed surveys, but then specifically we'll focus on those 18 agencies that responded to the survey that are large agencies with 500 or more sworn officers. The survey topics you see here, kind of the first screener question is whether the jurisdiction has experienced protests since May 25th. 2020, May 25th is the day that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And then from there, we ask a series of questions mostly related to body-worn cameras. We do ask about the civility of protests in a jurisdiction. I'll get to that. But the core questions for us really were, if you've had protests, were officers at those protests assigned to wear body-worn cameras? And then if so, tell us about those experiences, which included questions about live streaming, activation, the types of problems that an agency has experienced with a specific focus on battery life and recording capacity, whether body-worn cameras were useful, and if so, how. And then we also asked some questions about whether the agency had complaints filed against officers at those protests, and if so, body-worn cameras, were they present, thinking about the evidentiary value of cameras and how they could assist the department with the adjudication of any complaints that were filed. So let's jump right into it. What you see here, if you focus on the left side of the slide, this is the response to the question of whether or not a jurisdiction has had recent protests since May 25th. And you'll see two bars, all and large. So the all bar represents the responses of all 100 agencies. And you can see that 75% of the responding agencies indicated that they had had protests in their jurisdiction since May 25th. You can see that that is more common among the 18 large agencies that responded. 89% of the large agencies have, in fact, experienced recent protests. The other side of the slide is the follow-up question. Okay, you've had protests. Did your officers who were at those protests have body-worn cameras? And you can see the percentage is about the same for all 100 agencies as well as the 18 large. Just under 90% had body-worn cameras at the scene of those protests. The next set of questions, we tried to capture the issues or challenges that agencies experienced with body-worn cameras at protests. And like I said, we focused specifically on battery life and the recording capacity of body-worn cameras. And so if you look at the left side of this slide, you can see the percentage of agencies that said that things were good in that regard, that battery life was fine, that recording capacity was sufficient. And in fact, 81% of the agencies that responded said so. They didn't have any issues with battery life or recording capacity. Interestingly, the larger agencies that responded were more commonly or more likely to report problems. About a third said that they had some issues with battery life and recording capacity. 64% said everything was just fine. So interesting findings there. On the other side of the slide, we also asked about beyond those two issues, was there anything else that you struggled with regard to body-worn cameras in terms of technical issues? And the majority of the responding agencies, 78%, said no, didn't have any other problems. Again, we see a drop off a bit with the large agencies. Large agencies were more likely to experience other problems as well as the battery and recording capacity issues. And digging in on what those other issues were, the vast majority involved mounting of the cameras. And in Assistant Chief Carroll's presentation, I think he's going to talk a bit about some of the ways that that's been dealt with the DC Metro Police Department. All right. So, like I said, we asked the responding agencies to describe the civility of their protests, and we did this basically just to. And we asked agencies to, on a scale of 1 to 10, rate the civility, from 1 being very peaceful to 10 being very violent. What you see here are the responses of all of the agencies, all 100. And so, for example, 20% of the agencies indicated a 1, that their protests were very peaceful. And you can see the distribution. The average overall was about 3.8, which is certainly on the peaceful side. Looking at that same question for the 18 large agencies that responded to the survey, you can see some fairly significant differences. The mean or the average is 5.9, and you can see that the way the 18 large agencies responded to this question is much more focused on the violent end. 29%, for example, rated their protest as an 8. So pretty significant differences there in terms of this particular question between large agencies and all agencies. As I said, we also asked if body-worn cameras, if they felt body-worn cameras were useful at the protests, and the vast majority said yes. 81% of everybody, and 85% of the large agencies said yes. And as we dug into the reasons why an agency indicated that the cameras were useful, by far the most common benefit that was identified involved documentation The evidentiary value, just capturing what was happening, that was identified 60% of the time overall and 77% of the time for large agencies. So as I said, by far it was that ability to document through video and audio what is happening. A couple of other responses. Another one that was fairly common was that body-worn cameras are just as useful at protests as they are as everyday activities. And a handful of agencies also talked about how cameras can promote positive behavior. Just a few other findings of interest. We did ask agencies if they sent their officers to protest in other jurisdictions. And interestingly, 50% of agencies indicated that they had done that, that they had sent officers to protest in other jurisdictions, slightly less common for large agencies. We asked about activation, and the majority do require activation of the camera at protests. 81%, 71% for large agencies. What I will say about that, though, is particularly for large agencies, it was fairly common to have some sort of, I don't know if restriction is the right word, but that's the word I'll use, a restriction on activation, meaning the camera would not have to be activated until something specific happens, such as an officer observing criminal activity or direct contact between the officer and a citizen or protester beginning. So an officer at the scene wouldn't have to activate until one of those two things happened. But it was also fairly common for kind of just a blanket activation. We're going to record the entire protest. We asked about live streaming, which was extremely rare. Very few agencies were live streaming what was happening. And as I said, we asked about complaints. And among the 100 agencies that responded, only 18% reported having any complaints filed against their officers. But as you can see, that was much more common among the larger agencies. 2/3 of the large agencies reported that indeed complaints were filed against their officers. And if you recall from the earlier slide, body-worn cameras were present in the vast majority of those protests. So presumably the footage would be useful then in adjudicating those complaints. So just a quick summary before I turn it over to Assistant Chief Carroll. Most of the agencies that responded to the survey have had protests, but when we broke out the experiences of the large agencies, we see both the protests were more common and they were more violent in large agencies, or jurisdictions for large agencies, and perhaps as a result, complaints against officers were more common. Body-worn cameras were present at the majority of protests, and not only present, but activated and recording. And most of the responding agencies reported really no problems at all with their cameras. 80% said everything was sufficient, though, as I said, those problems were more common for the larger agencies. And again, I think Assistant Chief Carroll is going to talk about some of these issues from their experience. And then last, most agencies reported that BWCs were useful at protests. And again, by far the most common benefit was that documentation, capturing what happened. So I believe that's it for my presentation. I'm going to come back, as I said, on the back end and talk about some common themes and then handle questions. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Assistant Chief Carroll.
Thank you, Dr. White. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how the Metropolitan Police Department uses body-worn cameras in facilitation and with the First Amendment demonstrations. I wanted to start out today with a little bit of the history of how the body-worn camera program started in the Metropolitan Police Department. We began exploring them in October 2014, developing the policies and procedures. And in 2015, we deployed 400 body-worn cameras to determine the types of cameras that we actually wanted to use as we rolled them out fully to our patrol officers and our members. Between 2016 and 2018, we had a phased deployment of the second generation of Axion's body-worn cameras to our members. And during this deployment, we conducted a randomized controlled trial of member use and effectiveness. And as a result of this study, there's a white paper that's available on the Metropolitan Police Department's website. If anyone's interested, it kind of talks about the usefulness of these tools. Currently, we have migrated to the third generation of the Axon body-worn camera. It's the Axon Body 3. As far as usage, we currently have over 3,200 sworn police officers that are wearing body-worn cameras. These are our members, the rank of captain and below. Since we began deploying body-worn cameras, we have over 7.5 million videos, and in 2019 alone, we captured over 2 million videos. This amounts to over 40,000 videos a week. Throughout our deployment of the cameras, we've only had about 67 instances of the malfunctioning issues actually with the body-worn cameras. And to kind of address those issues, we keep maintaining spare body-worn cameras at our patrol districts and our locations for the officers if they were to run into an issue on a daily basis. In addition to the Axon camera, we also use the Axon View and the Capture apps. This allows our officers to take in categories videos and pictures from their departmental-issued cell phone that are actually tethered via Bluetooth to the camera. So when the officers are in the field, they can quickly review the video if necessary. They can also tag the videos to make it easier to locate later on. As we move into First Amendment demonstrations in general, the policy here at the Metropolitan Police Department regarding body-worn cameras is that our police officers activate their cameras when they respond to a First Amendment demonstration, but we do not record these demonstrations for the purpose of identifying individuals that are not engaged in unlawful conduct. As you can imagine, here in Washington, D.C., we have First Amendment demonstrations that occur in the city on a daily basis. Almost all are completely peaceful. The Metropolitan Police Department, we pride ourselves on how we handle First Amendment demonstrations. Our goal is to allow all groups and individuals to peacefully exercise their First Amendment rights, regardless of the content of their message. Some of the things we do to help facilitate that is to work with demonstration organizers, those that are willing to work with us to help them to facilitate their demonstrations. Also, we conduct training for our members that handle demonstrations. We conduct an initial week-long training for our officers, and we also recertify our officers 1 to 2 times a year to ensure that they're up to date on the policies and procedures of how to appropriately handle First Amendment demonstrations. We also employ arrest avoidance as a tactic, trying not to make arrests in situations where arrest is not necessary. However, over the past few years, and specifically over the past few months, we have had some demonstrations that have turned violent, which have resulted in assaults, property damage, and riotous activity. This would be both during the presidential inauguration in 2017 and then the demonstrations that erupted and then turned into riots following the death of George Floyd in late May and into June. When these activities have become violent in nature, our body-worn cameras have allowed the officers to capture and document a variety of criminal activity. It also documents the conditions that the officers are actually experiencing at the time and how they're responding to that type of activity. Maybe bottles being thrown, rocks, fireworks, whatever it is. So later on, it can actually be seen what the officer's response was. It also provides evidence on the scene as it occurs. Many times, especially in these rapidly evolving situations, that evidence can be lost through either the continuing emergency response operations that the fire department or EMS has to respond in, or through additional police response that may have to come in to reinforce the officers. Additionally, many times after riots occurs, the city wants to quickly clean up and restore the area to normalcy. So the BWCs allow that information to be captured, which is really useful later on. The photo and videos provided by the body-worn cameras provide the additional evidence for the prosecution of those individuals that are arrested as a result of the criminal activity. It's also very beneficial for those individuals that may not be arrested. Based on the body-worn camera video, we can develop bulletins, press releases, images that can be released to the public either through traditional media or through social media to help identify those individuals that may have engaged in criminal activity, but they were not actually arrested on the scene that day for a variety of reasons. It also allows officers to obtain arrest or search warrants for individuals after the incident occurs. As kind of noted before, it's also very useful for administrative investigations and potential civil lawsuits that may result as a response to the officers engaging protesters. Cases like use of force investigations, misconduct allegations that may be made as far as how the officers responded to the riotous activity and the level of force that was used. It also helps to document injuries to officers, how officers were injured during these demonstrations, which can be beneficial as we're trying to mitigate risk in future responses to officers, and we're looking at types of protective equipment that may be necessary to protect officers. It's also very useful in potential future training, either in the event of actually showing portions of body-worn camera video to officers as we incorporate that into our training of how we should be responding, maybe new tactics that we've seen or new methods that individuals are using. It's also very useful to help us develop scenarios for our officers to be put into as we're training them to make sure that they're appropriately responding depending on the type of incident they're actually engaging in. Some of the additional considerations and challenges that we've seen since we deployed our body-worn cameras related to First Amendment demonstrations, they really came up during the 2017 presidential inauguration. As I mentioned, we had a deployment of our cameras during that. And during those riots, we noticed several issues that came up and were highlighted by Dr. White when he talks about the results of the study. First was the body-worn camera battery issue. We learned that as our officers were deployed for extenuating periods of time, more so than their regular 8 to 10 hour shift that they work, the body-worn cameras were going dead. And in these types of cases, especially when you have very volatile situations, that body-worn camera footage is very important. So we developed a method that we used during the recent riotous activity we had here in the city to allow for hot swaps of body-worn cameras out in the field. And what that means is we had somebody from our IT units actually that was deployed out into the field, not inside the actual hot zone where operations were occurring, but close by. So when we had individuals whose body-worn cameras, the battery did die, we were able to get those cameras and swap it out and give the member a new body-worn camera in the field. And those could be on the back end associated with the appropriate officer. So that way the officer would have a fully charged body-worn camera, and then the one that was taken would be recharged and it could be reissued in the future. Something else that we learned in both these instances is when we talk about the very useful nature of the video obtained by body-worn cameras, one challenge it presents is the large volume of videos that will need to be reviewed, categorized by either your detectives who may be prosecuting the criminal cases and following up, or the internal affairs units if they're conducting use of force investigations. Hours upon hours of video by these officers, there's going to have to be a team of individuals that can go through there and identify the relevant video, the things that will be needed so that this evidence can be presented in court, presented to prosecutors, and they have this to make decisions about prosecution of individuals and confirming individuals that were involved in this activity. So for the inauguration and for the recent demonstrations that we had, we actually developed a task force of detectives whose sole purpose was to go through the videos and to identify this information to ensure we had it. Also, as a result, you have to ensure the videos are tagged and uploaded in a timely manner, so when your task force goes to look at this video, they can actually easily locate the video so it can be used. It was also very useful when we had to implement high volume arrest situations or making multiple arrests at locations for violations. Certain circumstances where things became especially violent during those arrests, individuals began throwing objects, rocks, bottles, fireworks at the police officers. They had to expedite removing the arrestees off the scene, and the body-worn cameras helped to document and confirm that these individuals were arrested, what vehicle they were transported in, who searched them, and the method of search that was used. And later on, when questions came up about the actions of officers and how searches were conducted, it was able to demonstrate clearly that the officer's response was within the policy and procedures. Another issue that we saw during the presidential inauguration, and we actually immediately followed up on and addressed, was the issue of the body-worn cameras coming off of members' uniforms, especially when they get in situations where they wear coats or things got very violent and they were running, fighting, things like that. Many of the magnetic clips would fall off or they could get knocked off by protesters. We also saw this issue for officers who had to wear rapid response gear, riot gear, turtle gear, depending on what the agency uses, some sort of protective gear for the officers. These cameras didn't stand well. Axion does make a MOLLE clip attachment for the camera. We actually got the MOLLE clip attachments for the camera, and we had tabs, pieces of material sewn on all of our coats, our outer vests for officers. They're their under uniform shirts, so if they're not wearing an outer vest in an administrative setting, and the rapid response gear, so they actually can attach their body-worn cameras via the MOLLE clip. That's been very successful during our recent deployments during the riotous activity. We did not have the cameras that were falling off and getting knocked off like we did during the presidential inauguration riots because of the inclusion of the MOLLE clip. and putting on the durable tabs on the uniforms to actually hold the cameras in place. So those are some of the experiences that we have here at the Metropolitan Police Department involving both First Amendment demonstrations, riotous activities, and the deployment of the body-worn cameras. I hope some of this information was useful to you. So now that wraps up my presentation. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ed McGuire.
So I am I'm a criminologist by training, and I study policing and violence. And one stream of my research focuses on the policing of protests. And in January of 2020, Megan Oakley and I released a guidebook for police based on research from a number of different disciplines, scientific disciplines, on policing protests. And that book is available at the link that we've provided here for free. And so everything I'll be talking about today is basically an excerpt from this guidebook. So I'm going to start off with just a few basic principles and concepts from constitutional law, then we'll turn to procedural justice and legitimacy, and then some concepts from crowd psychology, all of which are just useful background information for helping us think about how to shape appropriate strategies for handling protest policing. One of the issues that we see in a number of different agencies around the world is a really strong emphasis on tactics without a very clear emphasis on underlying strategies to inform those tactics. And so here's some background information to help us think about forming appropriate strategies. First, with regard to constitutional law, when we look at lawsuits, federal civil rights lawsuits, in the aftermath of protests gone bad, typically where we have violence between protesters and the police, we often see the same kinds of constitutional challenges, and those tend to focus on First Amendment freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press with regard to journalists having force used against them or being arrested. Another one we often see is Fourth Amendment challenges having to do with allegations of excessive use of force and allegations of false arrest. And then 14th Amendment challenges having to do with due process of law and with equal protection of the laws. And so these are typically the primary constitutional challenges that we see in these federal civil rights lawsuits, most of which are successful. They virtually never go to verdicts, but they are typically result in settlements, some of which are in excess of $10 million. And so one of the things that just a very sort of simple takeaway from this is our research suggests that in a lot of police agencies, police officers on the front line tend not to have a very good understanding of the First Amendment. And just a couple of quick takeaways, in the Chicago Police Department and the NATO protests, and in the Philadelphia Police Department under Chuck Ramsey, both departments issued First Amendment training. In Chicago, it was an online module, and not a bad idea if you have folks out on the front line handling First Amendment related activity to provide them with some sort of brief refresher training on First Amendment and what it allows. And body cameras are also really useful for documenting the various allegations that are made in these federal civil rights lawsuits pertaining to the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment. Next, we'll turn to procedural justice and legitimacy. Procedural justice has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. When I talk to police leaders, often they have a sort of a basic understanding of what it means, but I often get the same questions over and over again about exactly what it means for police policy and practice. And so just a really brief overview of what this means. So here you have on this screen a book cover from Tom Tyler. Tyler is a psychologist who wrote, among other, prolific author, but one of his famous books is Why People Obey the Law. And in that book, he lays out an argument that basically says one of the primary reasons why people choose to obey the law is because they view the law and the agencies that are responsible for carrying out the law or enforcing the law as legitimate institutions that are worthy of their voluntary compliance. And he goes on further to argue that one of the things that instills in people this feeling that the law and its agents are worthy of voluntary compliance is that they behave fairly, and that when police and other criminal justice officials behave in a way that's perceived as unfair, it not only undermines the institution of policing, but can even undermine the institution of law. And so people begin to view law as something that's more not necessarily applicable to them. It may reduce the voluntary sense of obligation to obey the law. And so here is just a basic diagram that provides sort of a logic model for procedural justice theory. And so you can think about at the far left there, procedural justice is, your officers out there every day interacting with the community, and particularly in enforcement situations, are they interacting with the community in a way that the community perceives as fair, legal, and appropriate? If so, then they're conferring legitimacy upon the institution, which results in a voluntary sense of obligation to comply with the officer, to cooperate with the officer, and even to support police. And this support, we've been writing about it for years, but we're really seeing this rise to the fore recently with this defund the police movement, which is, when an institution is not seen as legitimate, it loses the support of the community. And we're starting to see some of that, whether fairly or unfairly. That support issue is coming up a lot lately with this defund the police movement. And so the underlying principle here is that, as applied to protests, we need to ensure that our officers are behaving in a manner that people perceive as fair and legal, and that when we lose that, it encourages lawbreaking among the people in the crowd. And so we carried out research in a number of U.S. cities where we surveyed protesters about their attitudes toward police. And we were particularly interested in knowing, do you believe that the use of violence against police officers is a legitimate protest tactic for achieving your objectives, your social movement objectives? And, what we found is that, and this is common, I think, is that a small number of people in protest movements actually think it's okay to hurt cops. And depending on the severity of the violence that we're talking about, whether it's, pushing and shoving or throwing a harmful object or using weapons against police, it's a very small proportion of people who endorse those things. But what we found is the principal factor that distinguishes those who think it's okay to hurt cops and those who think it's not is simply having observed police officers behave in an unfair and overly forceful manner, either against them personally or against their peers within the protest movement. And essentially, this is evidence in favor of procedural justice theory as applies to protests. If people believe that officers are behaving in an unfair manner, they're more willing to think it's okay, or they're more likely to think it's okay to use violence against police officers. And so obviously we want to avoid turning the crowd against us. Okay, so, fair and effective protest policing strategies, we ought to really think about how do we enact strategies that aim to secure voluntary compliance. And what we're trying to do is essentially win hearts and minds, right? We don't want to make the mistake, and we're seeing this mistake being made right now in Portland. We don't want to instigate a sense of defiance or rebellion among protesters, because when that happens, we're not making things better, we're making things worse and potentially instigating violence and inflaming a sense of unfairness among protesters. So that's to be avoided whenever possible. And next, crowd psychology. So just a very basic perspective here is we should not view crowds as homogeneous. Crowds don't have people who all look at the world and look at police and look at the social movement in the exact same way. Crowds are typically heterogeneous with lots of different types of people in them. And so the major consideration here is that most crowds contain a majority of people who the crowd psychology folks refer to as moderates. These are people who show up to a protest with an inclination to behave peacefully, behave lawfully. but most crowds also, even in social movements that claim to be nonviolent, most crowds also have a minority of people that the crowd psychologists refer to as radicals, who show up with an intent to behave in a destructive, violent manner. And the principal lesson that we learn from crowd psychology is that we cannot treat the entire crowd in one way. We have to differentiate how we treat the people in the crowd. You treat the people who are behaving lawfully and peacefully one way, and you treat the people who are behaving violently and destructively in another way. And if you don't do that, what we've learned from decades of crowd psychology research is that if you take enforcement action against an entire crowd, tear gassing or using kinetic impact munitions against an entire crowd, what happens is you lose the moderates. The moderates, instead of siding with law and order, instead of siding with the police, they start to side with the radicals, and they start to view more radical protest strategies as legitimate. And that's a crowd psychology that we want to be very careful about triggering. We don't want to lose the moderates. We want to win their hearts and minds by behaving in a fair manner and treating them differently than the people who are engaged in setting fires or using violence or whatever unlawful behavior there may be. And so, the punchline here is win the hearts and minds of the peaceful members of the crowd. And when we can do that, the dynamic that we see in lots of crowd events is we see the crowd start to police itself. What you want is the moderates out there exerting pressure on the radicals to not do dumb, illegal stuff, not do hurtful, violent kinds of things. And so we want to trigger that kind of self-policing within the crowd. As soon as we lose the moderates, we lose that self-policing dynamic, and now it's all up to the police, and that's not something that we want to happen. Okay, we want to engage these folks to help us out and help trigger that self-policing within the crowd. The photograph that you see here is a picture from Sweden. Sweden, after some tragedies at crowd events resulting in deaths of crowd members and serious injuries to police officers, put in place a program called the Dialogue Police. And these are police officers who go out into the crowd wearing this type of colorful vest like you see here. And their only job is to be in the crowd, engaging in dialogue with protesters and creating a sense that police officers are human beings. They're not stormtroopers, they're not robots. They're human beings just like you. We want to humanize the police at these types of events because it tends to reduce the likelihood that people want to hurt police. And so I'm going to just go over really quickly a 4-part framework that we talk about in the book in much more detail. And this is our recommended approach based on multiple scientific disciplines for how to handle these types of events. And so much of this framework is based on about 4 decades of crowd psychology research. And the framework has these 4 components: education, facilitation, communication, and differentiation. So education, quite simply, is police need to educate themselves prior to an event about who's showing up, what their social identity is, what it is they're seeking to accomplish, and just essentially understanding the composition of a crowd and their intentions. Because knowing that information, when it's possible, it's not always possible when a spontaneous protest erupts, but whenever it's possible, it's really useful to know this information because you can tailor your approach accordingly and develop more nuanced policing strategies for handling these events. The second piece is facilitation. You want to be seen by the crowd as facilitating peaceful protest, not as blocking it or seeking to regulate or obstruct it in some way. When you are seen as obstructing First Amendment activity, you tend to trigger that defiance and rebellion that I talked about earlier. Some folks question whether it's appropriate or possible to do this when the protest focuses on the police themselves. And, the argument here is that it's especially important to facilitate protests when you're the object of the protest, because these are much touchier types of events, and it's much easier to lose the audience. Essentially, what you can do by being seen as obstructing protests against the police is it all becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You want to avoid that whenever possible. And communication, we like to see it before the event, during the event, and after the event. Communication between policing and protesters. And even in spontaneous events, it's still possible to identify, even leaderless movements and spontaneous events where they're not necessarily very organized. There are often people who have some sort of a organizing type role, even if it's informal, that you can be communicating with. And this communication is really important. And we're talking about two levels of communication: one-on-one types of communication that humanize the officers, and then communication with the crowds using public address systems. And so we like to see just regular routine communication throughout an event, because it's really easy during an event for misinformation and rumors to fly around the crowd, and you don't want to lose the message like that. And the final piece is differentiation, and this is the idea that you're not handling everybody the same way. You're not going to tear gas and shoot kinetic impact munitions at the moms, right? The moms who are protesting peacefully and lawfully, but you may need to use enforcement activity against people who are setting fires, damaging property, looting, throwing things, and those kinds of things. And so you need to have that differentiated approach where not everybody gets treated in the same way when it comes to enforcement action, because that's where you really lose the crowd and you really start to encourage rebellion, defiance, and increasing violence rather than decreasing it. And then the last piece is we like to see departments having a policy dictating the appropriate use of riot gear. There are, of course, appropriate uses of riot gear, but what we like to avoid is showing up at events in riot gear can often tend to trigger the problems you're trying to prevent. So we recommend what we call, and we go into detail on this in the guidebook, but we recommend what we call a graded response plan. And as part of that plan, you're showing up to a nonviolent protest with, if you're concerned about it turning violent or destructive or riotous, you're staging officers off-site nearby. It could be in an air-conditioned bus or in a building in riot gear, or maybe in a second level in between riot gear and soft uniforms, what the Boston police refer to as hats and bats with the riot helmets and the riot batons. Could be a middle level in between. But all of this needs to be trained. And one of the things that goes wrong sometimes in this staging or rotating officers out is, as Chief Carroll mentioned and Mike White mentioned, is part of that training needs to involve, and equipment needs to involve making sure that your body cameras can be easily switched between different uniform types, that you have appropriate mounting hardware and so forth, so that this sort of rapid graded response plan can be implemented and can include the body cameras. And folks, with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. White. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks to both of our presenters. I thought what I'd do before opening up to questions is just spend a minute talking about some of the key themes we heard across presentations. And a couple of things came to mind as I was furiously writing during the two presentations. The first involves body-worn camera policy. If you are a grantee in this funding program, you know that we focus a lot of time on policy. And so it would seem to be critically important to have in your body-worn camera policy language about the use of the cameras during protests. And that certainly would help in terms of reducing unknowns, reducing some of the surprises. And in other work that we've done with grantees, we do a policy analysis, and we have a report in which we examined over 300 body-worn camera policies. And it's interesting because close to 70% of those policies make no mention at all of the use of cameras at protests. So I think that would be a good starting point, is to have policy language about this that you can then relay to your officers. And the second piece of that then would be to have frequent review of the policy, especially with officers before known or planned events, to review what the policy says with regard to body-worn cameras. And then, of course, you could do that after, in an after-action kind of way, what worked with the cameras, what didn't, what do we need to modify. The third point I wanted to make, one of the survey findings that I think was really interesting was that 50% of respondents said they sent officers to protests in other jurisdictions. And that, I think, has some real implications as well for cameras. Obviously, if you're going to be sending your officers to other jurisdictions, there should be some planning ahead of time, a coordinating committee, so you have representatives from the different agencies together and kind of charting a plan of action and troubleshooting ahead of time. And some of that will involve body-worn cameras. I mean, our agency is going to have the same policies with regard to activation and other things. So just planning ahead if you're going to send your officers to other jurisdictions. And the primary thought I had when I was listening to Assistant Chief Carroll is, draw on the expertise of your colleagues. It's clear that the DC Metro Police Department has a lot of firsthand experience with this. So if you're a chief of police, reach out to folks and tap into their expertise. Just two final quick points before we move to questions. Dr. McGuire's guidebook is free. Download it, read it. That would seem to be a really important first step. And I love the idea of doing a review of some of the relevant constitutional issues before a planned event. You could roll that into the review of the body-worn camera policy as well. And in particular, I really find compelling the interaction between procedural justice and crowd psychology. That not all crowds, or not everyone in the crowd is the same. There are different subgroups, and those moderates represent a group of folks who you really want to focus on and gain their cooperation. And then last, just with regard to the framework that Dr. McGuire talks about in terms of effective protest policing, education, facilitation, communication, differentiation, I can think of numerous ways that body-worn cameras are going to facilitate the implementation of those different components. So those were just some thoughts I had. I think at this point we can turn to questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. Excellent information from the panel. So we'll try and get to a couple questions that we have, and if we can't get to all the questions that were submitted, we will address these and post these later for the audience to reference in the future. So let's just start with this question. In your opinion, looking at the protests now, what are departments not learning or implementing from previous protests to now in the usage of body-worn cameras? So Adam, I'm going to throw this one at you. It's a broad question, but are departments learning and adapting and better utilizing body-worn cameras with protests than previously?
Yeah, I mean, I think body cam usage is increasing dramatically. It's certainly compared to what we saw during the Occupy protests, where many of the agencies were not wearing cameras, and we're starting. Axion has produced mounting brackets that make these things much easier for agencies to be able to attach to different types of uniforms and so forth. So I think we're using body-worn cameras much more frequently, and that's a good thing. And the footage is often confusing and chaotic, and these are really chaotic events. But having multiple video perspectives on what happened is really useful. And I thought Chief Carroll gave a great overview of one of the issues that comes up at a lot of these types of events, because they're so chaotic, particularly when you have mass arrests, is that it's almost impossible to write a really effective police report on each individual you arrest when you have these highly dynamic, chaotic situations. And body camera footage is useful for helping you sort of reconstruct what happened and provide evidence that previously wasn't available. So I think it's very useful.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Appreciate that. Jeff, just a pretty brief question, I think. Any recommendations for agencies who are deploying officers to address protests on any enhancements when it comes to placement or retention and how the cameras are secured? Are there extra considerations for protests?
Well, I think for protests, it's kind of like I talked about before. I mean, we modified how we deploy, not just for protests, but we actually expanded that to all of our uniforms because of the issues that we saw during the riots that occurred with the inauguration. And that was really because the officers were running, they were, having contact, doing a lot of things that maybe on most day-to-day operations police officers don't do. So I think that, based on that, we really modified that not only for First Amendment demonstrations that we encounter, but also for day-to-day operations. So, I also sit on our use of force review board, and many times when you have situations where serious use of force is used and people are wrestling, those cameras were popping off. So it was beneficial for First Amendment demonstrations and for other situations for officers. So I think it's just a good process to look at for overall.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate that. Mike, I'm going to throw this at you. It's a kind of a combination question. There's some that are similar. So it goes to policy language. Do departments have specific language about activation during protests? When you say activation is required at protests, do you mean recording the whole time that you're doing the event, or just upon an incident specific? So I guess it goes to policy with protests specifically related to when activation should occur. Mike, you want to touch on that?
Sure, Tom. Most of the respondents indicated that activation occurs and that they're recording during the entire event. About a third said that they would only do so in response to something specific like observed criminal activity, like direct contact. But I was a little surprised to see the large number that, at least in their policy, have just general language saying you will activate and record, period. But again, about a third were a little more specific, and that was more common among the larger agencies as well.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I'll throw this question back at you and Ed specifically. The question came in: what factors would you attribute to the violence in larger cities rather than smaller cities? So a larger proportion of violence, I believe the question is referring to in larger cities. Is there anything that you can note about that? Ed, start with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure because we haven't studied this yet, so I'm just speculating. But, one of the issues that comes up at these types of events, I talked about communicating both before, during, and after these events. What happens at these events is your relationship with your community, and in particular, your social justice communities, these really dictate how things go at events. And I can remember during the Occupy movement, for instance, I remember being out in Salt Lake City, and Mike Brown, who's the chief now, at the time was deputy chief. Remember the quote, I have it in the guidebook, but Mike said, I bought gallons of coffee for those guys. In other words, this was not just police showing up in riot gear and handling things in a very enforcement-oriented way. This was police leaders around the country. Billy Evans in Boston was another great example, who had really worked hard to develop relationships with the social justice community that tends to show up frequently at these types of protests, so that when the protests happened, they were able to capitalize on those pre-existing relationships and sort of keep things calm. And I think we often see in smaller communities, those relationships may be more tightly formed than in some of the larger cities. But I think that's a takeaway from all of this is, it's at times like this that you really depend on that social capital that you've built with these communities.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a great answer. Mike, anything additional to what Ed said?
No, not really. I mean, in terms of the survey, we didn't collect any sort of information about that. What Ed said makes a lot of sense to me, and I wonder about the makeup of the crowds in terms of the moderates and the radicals, and whether there tend to be a larger percentage of radicals in protests that occur in larger jurisdictions. But I don't have any evidence to support that. It's just something I wonder about.
Okay, great. And I'll make this the last question as we wind down, and I think I'll turn it to Jeff, and if Mike and Ed have anything additional. So with all the media attention and narratives on what protests are actually doing or not doing, we don't seem to see a lot of timely release of body-worn camera footage by police. Should the police better utilize footage and release it more proactively to help provide a clearer perspective on what is actually happening, whether it's good or bad? Jeff, thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think that police departments, a lot of police departments don't do a very good job overall in actually kind of showing what the officers are doing and how they're responding, not only to First Amendment demonstrations, but in general. Some of the larger police departments have a much more proactive and forward-facing, especially on social media, as far as putting out videos and images and live streaming, press conferences and things like that, whereas others don't. I think there's definitely benefit in that. Recently in Chicago, I know there was a situation where their officers took a variety of objects being thrown at them by protesters, and I know that they released some camera footage and did a press release kind of overviewing and during the press conference of what the officers did, so folks can actually see what the officers were actually experiencing. A lot of times, if you go on social media, you'll be able to see a live stream from a perspective of maybe someone in the group or in the crowd. But when you see the perspective from the officers, and you see the cans and the bottles and the fireworks that are being shot in there, and you see people getting hit in the head, I think for the general public overall, it helps them to understand what really is going on there. And you can get that information. So I don't think police departments do a very good job of that. I think it's an area where we can definitely improve overall, so people can understand, why we use the tactics that we do use, and they can see the types of attacks these officers are being, coming upon them by certain segments of these groups and individuals that are out there.
Good. Thank you, Chief. And I'll just throw it to Ed and Mike. Anything additional on that from your research or observations with police about the benefits of proactively releasing video for protest?
Yeah, this is Ed McGuire. So anything you can do to humanize the police in the eyes of protesters and the public is useful. We're seeing now the police referred to as stormtroopers and soldiers, and we're even starting to see terms like Gestapo used, right? I even heard somebody on a webinar recently say that, when police are wearing riot gear, it's okay to throw objects at them because they're protected. There's this tendency to not see who's in that uniform as a human being, and anything we can do to humanize them through our communication campaign will be helpful.
It's very good. I'd like to just thank everybody definitely for taking the time during your busy schedules to join us for the webinar. Our goal was to provide you with some helpful information and insights regarding body-worn cameras as it relates to protests with larger agencies. And as mentioned, we will be following up this webinar with another part 2 that will address protest implications with smaller agencies. So we're going to make that date announcement soon. It'll likely be in the next month or so. So we hope you found this helpful. I want to send out a lot of appreciation to our expert panel. I thought it was fantastic. I'd also like to provide a special thank you to David Lewis from BJA, as well as Carrie Shelton and Bridget Bryson from CNA for their leadership and all the behind-the-scenes work that went into orchestrating this webinar. I also want to again extend our appreciation to BJA and OJP for making this webinar possible. Thank you all for your service, especially at this pivotal point in time, and everyone please stay safe and healthy, and this will conclude today's webinar. Thank you.